So I am supporting the First Nation Public Service Secretariat, also known as FNPSS, which is hosting this data-related knowledge sharing series on behalf of the First Nations Information Governance Center, also known as FNIGC or FNIG, and the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative, BCFNDGI. So we've got a lot of acronyms out there now, and you'll be able to recognize some of them. FNPSS's mission is to build core public service excellence in governments and administration in BC through training, webinars, and projects. And you can learn more about the First Nation Public Service Secretariat on their website, fnps.ca. And for today's session, it really comes out of the fact that BC First Nations governments have called for and are now preparing for the implementation of a national First Nations data governance strategy, FNDGS, which includes the formation of a data center to serve BC First Nations governments. This summer knowledge sharing series is being held to support First Nations as they work towards building capacity in data governance and information management. Today's 90-minute session is on data governance, government-to-government data quality and sharing agreements, and we're very pleased to have two specialists in this area share with all of you today, Gwen Phillips and Harmony Johnson. And in terms of a little bit of background before I hand it over to Gwen to begin us in a good way, I wanted to let you know that Harmony is the interim vice president of Indigenous Wellness and Reconciliation at Providence Healthcare. She's of Tla'amin First Nation ancestry and was raised in Tla'amin territory where most of her family resides. She co-authored an amazing book on her grandmother's teachings that I absolutely love. She also operates a consulting business providing strategy and advisory services and teaching related to Indigenous health, governance, and human rights, and has served in senior roles with the In Plain Sight Review in BC Healthcare and with the First Nations Health Authority, First Nations Summit, and First Nations Forestry Council. Gwen, on the other hand, Gwen Phillips is a citizen of the Ktunaxa Nation and has worked for the Ktunaxa Nation Council for the past 38 years, holding all kinds of senior management roles in education, health, corporate services, traditional knowledge, and language. For the past 20 plus years, Gwen has been part of a team that's leading the Ktunaxa Nation back to self-government. She founded the First Nations Data Governance Initiative, which I mentioned earlier, which is a tripartite government initiative, federal, provincial, and First Nations governments working together to provide timely access to quality data for planning, managing, and accounting for investments and outcomes associated with First Nations well-being. She is also on the FNIG board and BC Data Governance Champion at the national level. With that, I will hand it over to Gwen. Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwyn, and thank you to the First Nations Public Service Secretariat for supporting the First Nations Information Governance Center in this round of engagement discussions. The FNIGC is beginning the implementation of what's been long called for, and that is to establish a center, so really an institution in British Columbia and one in every province and territory, but in British Columbia, an institution governed by and to serve First Nations governments. And so this summer, as we lead up to, hopefully, seeing some resources come from the federal budget, which were promised, and now we have an election and we know what that means. So it'll probably be closer to Christmas by the time we see some resource. But to hold space and to bring I guess, a conversation to the front of people's minds, we wanted to have three discussion sessions, three webinars following a series of discussion sessions earlier this spring to keep the momentum going. And these three sessions, the initial one focused on data sovereignty, which is about assertion of your ownership over your identity and the data that relates to that, including your intellectual property. This one will focus on data governance, which is taking that assertion to a practical level and really thinking about how would I do this in the space of being a government. And we'll also talk about government to government in this session. And then the next session will get right down to records and information management. So without further ado, I would just like to say thank you to all of you for joining us today and offer up a thank you to the Creator for bringing us all today and ask that He guide us in a good way, that the Creator offer up blessings to all those in need of blessings today and reminding us of the humble humans we are, to give thanks for the rain that is falling today to help ease the wildfires, and to please give love and caring to all of those that are feeling the stresses that we're all feeling in this time of chaos. So please, Creator, bless all of us and humble us as we do this work together in a good way. I'll also acknowledge that I'm coming to you today not from my own territory. I'm coming to you from the territory of the Blackfeet peoples in Alberta. So I'm going to introduce to you Harmony Johnson, and she will start our session off, and then I'll sweep up at the end of it all, focusing more on the data sharing agreement. So Harmony, welcome.
Thank you, Gwen, and thanks, Bronwyn, for that kind introduction. I'm Harmony. My ancestral name is Tla'amin, and I'm from the Tla'amin Nation at the northern end of the Sunshine Coast. I am joining today from Tsleil-Waututh territory. So data governance can seem really complicated and can kind of make people's eyes glaze over a bit. I'm not coming to this conversation as, despite Bronwyn introducing me as a specialist, I'm not a data specialist. I am an administrator, and I'm someone who consumes and uses evidence to support system change that makes things better for our people. And sometimes I'm doing that at a local level with supporting my own nation. And sometimes I'm doing that at a provincial level, like I did with the In Plain Sight report. Sometimes I'm doing that on a regional level, like what I'm trying to do at Providence Healthcare. So in doing that, I've had some experience in trying to work with data in a way that is ethical and affirming for our people and supporting their rights. And so I'm going to talk through some of those experiences today. I'm going to try to keep it kind of plain language and not totally data-ish, but I do get excited about the subject matter. So, so you can just ask me for clarification if I'm talking in some sort of way that is not clear to everyone. I thought I saw Laurel Lemchuk-Favel's name in the list of participants here today, so I just have to pause and acknowledge that, you know, I'm here talking today, but a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about is work that Laurel and I have done and continue to do in partnership. So just want to acknowledge that a lot of what I'm talking about is work that she and I have done together. So if we can pull up the slides, that would be great. What I'm not an expert in is designing slides. So my apologies for how boring the slides look. But I thought it might be helpful to have enough words on the slide to where you'll be able to take them away and maybe understand the flow of my thinking throughout. So if we can just kind of go to the next slide. I'm just going to start with a bit of like, what are we talking about? What do these words mean? Why do we even talk about data? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the context in which we do this work, and that it results from this history that is still very much with us when we are doing data work. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think, where Indigenous governments are at with our thinking and our needs in this space. Then I'm going to talk about how do you kind of think about setting up data governance processes internal to a government. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how hard it is to get our data that exists in other places and some ways to think about that and things to expect as you're trying to go through that journey. So that's essentially the flow of my little talk today. Okay, yes, this is what I mean about my poor graphic design. Like, I don't even know where this came from. It's some sort of Rubik's Cube. So anyway, it's without meaning. The idea here is, why do we have and think about data? And we can have and use data for multiple different purposes that tie to what we need to do as Indigenous governments and our strategies and our strategic plans and our goals and our vision statements. So what we want to do, well, we want to improve the well-being of our people. someone like me who kind of tends to work in the health sector talk about this as like population health, but really it's like, how do we know that our people are doing well? We want to identify indicators that tell us that's the health of our population, and we want to monitor them. And often those indicators can be identified locally, but they can also be reported on at a provincial level. So we might say that, for my people, maybe an indicator of our well-being is our ability to access language lessons in Ayajutha language, our language. Whereas provincially, we might talk about an indicator more broadly about ability to access learning about our Indigenous language, whatever that may be. But we want an ability to do that, and that's what data can do for us. And that helps us figure out and apply that data to improve what we're doing day to day. So our very operational needs. So in that case, we might have an indicator about our ability to access, like I said, language education. Well, operationally, that data can help us better design the accessibility of our language programming, right? Maybe we're not offering in the right hours, who knows? But the data helps us diagnose a problem and make an improvement. It helps us strategically. So it helps our leadership of our governments identify, say, 5-year goals, targets for indicators that we want to measure to be able to deploy our people and our assets towards a shared goal that is evidence-based. We want to use that to advocate. This is where we've seen major system change, is when we can use our data in an ethical way and create the right platform to share that data. That's what leads to increased investment and policy and legislative change that makes our lives better. We want to evaluate how well we're doing in our programs and services, and data helps us do that. And then research, we have research questions, and data informs and guides those research questions and helps us answer those research questions. So that's really all these awesome reasons why we care about data and the functions that governments need to carry out that rely heavily on data and data governance. Next slide. So what am I even talking about when I'm using the term data? So in my way of thinking, it's not just like statistical measures or numbers, but it is qualitative and quantitative information that is, as we said, it's collected, it's our evidence, it's how we know what we're doing matters, how we know what we're doing is working, how well we're doing kind of as a community or as a people. So, qualitative data is the stuff we can, it's like experiential, right? The stuff we can see, observe, touch, feel, taste. And then quantitative are the things that we count. So for example, we might say like the salmon is, say, male or female. That would be a qualitative piece of data, or there are 5 salmon would be quantitative. And then a database is where we kind of collect all of that information together in a way that we can access the data and manage it. And I'm going to be using these terms throughout today's talk. Next slide. Gwen touched on this already, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail into these definitions. They're here for you, and this is really the sequence of this webinar series, right? So you talked about data sovereignty the first time. Essentially, we have rights. Today, we're going to talk about data governance, which is how do we apply those rights to our way of thinking about how we ensure that our data is of high quality, what are the standards we set for that, what are the processes we work through, and then management is how do we operationalize that day to day, and that'll be your next webinar. Next slide. So we can't kind of uncouple this conversation about data from the truth of the history that exists in this space that very much is still with us today. That our people come from a tradition that an oral tradition, and that's how we transmitted knowledge and science and data and history relative to introduction of settler colonialism here, and that being founded in a written tradition. And essentially that those two knowledge systems, settler colonialism also introduced this this unfounded belief that our way of doing things was less scientific and less credible. And we know that that's not true, but that belief is still very much alive in how data systems operate. And there is still this kind of underlying stereotypes about our knowledge systems being less worthy, less credible, less scientific. We know that's not true, as I said, but this is a reality of the space we work in, is that we still do have this tension between knowledge systems and this racism about whose knowledge system is better. So that's history that is not, I would say, is still actually very much in the present. Our people in data, we have not had great experiences being counted in the past, right? That mechanisms around colonialism, like the Indian Act and registration systems and all of these things, were intended to kind of count for the purpose of controlling and eliminating people. And so that it's not been necessarily in the past to our benefit to be counted. And we're still very much dealing with that and needing to make sure that that the reason to be counted is actually to our benefit. That is something that we deal with a lot in healthcare today, as we know that our people that come through, for example, the hospital where I work, we ask them, would you like to self-identify? And many people choose not to, because they don't feel like it's to their benefit to be counted as Indigenous. So this is very much still with us today. We also know that there's lots of other people making decisions for us about like how we get counted or measured and what story that tells. And that's not really often, unless we're doing this work locally and driven by us, often has been determined by some other government. We also know that there's been like theft of our intellectual property, theft of our genetic material, theft of our data without any benefit to us. And so there is a history of kind of data and research that, again, has been exploitative of our people, and again is still kind of part of the environment that we're all trying to work in. As much as we're all data champions, we know that these are complexities in our history that are why we're here today to talk about data sovereignty and governance. And then finally, often the data is used to tell this story about us that's like not true, that talks about our inherent pathology, our inherent vulnerability and disorganization, when really what the data is talking about are systems of oppression and systems failure of Indigenous peoples. That being First Nations, being a First Nations person doesn't make me inherently vulnerable. It's all of these other systems of oppression that create exclusion and marginalization of people. And so these studies have been produced that kind of reinforce that stereotyping narrative. And this is why data sovereignty and data governance is so important, is that if we can control the data and if we govern the data ourselves, then we can break this cycle of the past, and we can break this transmission of stereotyping about us without us. Next slide. So again, this is where data sovereignty and rights to data governance come in. So I know you talked about this last time, so I'm not going to cover this in detail, but essentially within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we have throughout the 46 articles in UNDRIP, there are standards that relate to our rights to maintain, protect, and develop ourselves, our own identities, our intellectual property, our nations, our traditions, our customs, our knowledge, our scientific systems, and our ways of transmitting that to future generations. So those are our rights, and these all, underlying all of that is data. And then, of course, there's the OCAP principles, which I think we're discussed in quite a lot of detail last time, but this is kind of a way of thinking about ownership and control being how we govern, like our rights to govern the data, and access possession, how we're managing our data as governments. Next slide. So this is like my depressing slide about how hard it is to work with data. So I don't want everybody to necessarily be feeling really bummed out. But this is just, things to know about the complexity of working in the data environment. So someone like me, I'm a Tla'amin person. I access services, different services. My identity's kind of in different places. It's tied to my driver's license. It's tied to my status card. There are ways in which I'm touching services and that my data kind of exists out in federal and provincial data systems. So this slide kind of captures what it's like to try to kind of chase some of that data when we're working as governments. So that data I talked about, right? Like some of my health data is in one part of the system, my education data is in another part of the system. There are different government sources and different databases across these different sectors. And they don't necessarily talk to each other. It's not built to talk to each other. There's a lot of work to be done to try to bring those things together in a way where we can understand truly what is going on. So that's one way in which it's fractured, right? It's all in different places. So if we were like, oh, I really want to understand early childhood data that's available about Tla'amin kids, I would have to go to the Ministry of Education. I would have to go to the Ministry of Health. There's a number of ways I would have to try to chase that information to pull that together for my nation. So it doesn't really talk to each other. It also doesn't necessarily always include an identifier for indigeneity, right? So there might be lots of databases where our data is represented, but it's not tied to us as Indigenous people. It's just all people just lumped in a big database. So you can't always pull data ready-made that has an Indigenous identifier. So we could say, okay, Indigenous and let's say kids who graduate grade 12. Sometimes those things are tracked together and sometimes they're not. The surveys that we run, they're great in that they're Indigenous-led surveys. They tend to have a strengths-based frame to the indicators. That's great, and that's a good source of data for us. And a lot of communities have participated in, for example, the Regional Health Survey and some of the other surveys run through FNIGC. The limitations are that not all First Nations participate. So you would have to see, did my nation participate in that survey or not that year? And there's, those surveys are only collected amongst Indigenous people. So we wouldn't be able to compare results against a non-Indigenous population. And sometimes we do want to do that. As much as we hate the kind of close the gap terminology, in some ways, the gap is not our deficit. The gap is the measurement of system failure towards us. So sometimes we do want to point to that system failure and use that to advocate for system change and improvement. The data that is collected is not necessarily tied with our needs, worldviews, or priorities. So we're often chasing or reporting on indicators or measures based on what data is already there or what other people have deemed to be important because we're working with existing data and we didn't drive that data collection in the first place. The other thing that will be really common is that the geographic units that are sometimes used in that data don't match up with our geographic units. So, you know, they might measure by like health region or some other kind of catchment area that they've identified, and it wouldn't necessarily tie to our nation territories, for example. And again, a lot of that data collection would be based on what kind of a Western worldview or paradigm would deem to be important. And sometimes those indicators are not aligned with our way of thinking or being in the world. Variable accuracy due to Indigenous identity. So like we rely a lot on Indigenous self-identification, which can be accurate, can sometimes not be accurate, right? Like sometimes I might not feel like identifying myself because maybe I feel like it won't result in any benefit to me, right? So if I feel like maybe self-identifying might result in poorer care, then maybe I'm not going to self-identify. And someone like me who's kind of white passing can make that choice, and that's like privilege that I have that a lot of people don't. So that's one way in which self-identification kind of has a bit of a potential flaw or inaccuracies. The other is that, you know, obviously status is a system we're all working in, this concept of Indian status, but it is not one that's created by us, and it's not the same as how our people may identify citizenship or membership in our nations and governments. So that's kind of just an issue that we're kind of stuck with for the time being. Cell size, this is going to be a big problem. Data governance protocols that other governments use are really driven by privacy considerations, and often in our communities we'll be requesting data about specifically our nations or communities, and often the data we'll get back is about a pretty small subset of our community or our citizens. So if it's say under 10 people, it won't get reported to us. So we'll be hitting up on these issues of, is there any usable data, or are the cell size too small? And what we found in previous analyses is that a population size of about 2,000 is needed to get some basic data analysis that's usable. And then like 5,000 would be a better population to work with to be a bit more comprehensive in data analysis and reporting. So that gives you a sense of like, most of our communities are not relying on a population size of 2,000 or 5,000 people. So working with kind of groups, working within our nation groupings kind of more broadly, gives us a better population size to work with, and also gives us a bit more strength to be able to hammer through some of these other barriers that I'm talking about. The last one is that data is not necessarily always timely. So like a big survey will be run, for example, then you've got to go through all the analysis and reporting and everything else. And then by the time you get your data, it's like 3 or 4 years old. Like it can mean that by that time things have changed or our priorities have changed. So this is something that's a problem with this big churning kind of data sets, and we only get periodic little reports out of. So kind of getting into a different cycle with more timely data is something that is, I think a lot of people are moving more towards. Yes, so a really good point made in the chat that like ultimately all of these systems are baffling language-wise. So one is that there's like all these acronyms and like data things that are used that are like alienating to people, right? And can make it seem like a really daunting space to be in. And like, I hope I'm not using too many of them so far, but it's a real slippery slope. So like often it can be like just daunting to even be a part of. And then absolutely the point made that a lot of these databases and systems just literally don't speak our language, right? So we can't capture the things that are meaningful to us in them. That's a good point, thank you. Next slide. So hopefully things are getting better. Like that was a real downer of a slide, I know, but it's just like a bit of like a reality check of like, you know, we can all get really hyped up about doing this work, but the reality is that there are limitations that we need to be aware of and be able to know how we're going to trade off or handle those when we hit upon them. On the plus side, there's a real meaningful effort and commitment, both federally and provincially, to support better access to and collection and quality of data, and like more so than I've ever seen. And so I'm like leaning right in on this and I have high hopes for it. So they use this term desegregated data, which is kind of like, what does that mean? But it's essentially just data that I've been talking about, data about us that can be used to highlight where we have system failure or system inequities or systems of oppression against certain people. And that there's a commitment to actually just surfacing that in a more meaningful way. In the In Plain Sight review we did, it was really important to us that we produced a very evidence-based report that clearly demonstrated that racism is the most profound determinant of ill health amongst Indigenous people. And that's not our fault. Like, that's not our problem. Like, that is system failure. And that report isn't about our health and well-being as much as that's about flaws in the system that need to be addressed. And so this commitment to better disaggregated data is intended to support system change, but will also create opportunity for more access to data about us and more data available for Indigenous governments to use. Next slide. So what do Indigenous governments need? Like, I'm kind of making this up, but I'm not making it up in a vacuum. This is based on some work that I've done over the last 10 years in working with First Nations in BC in particular about like how do they want to use data and what do they actually need to support their functioning. So one, they want data that matters to them. So their own like ability to drive their own indicators, as well as like close the gap or deficit data to advocate for equity. So again, that deficit data isn't our deficit, that's the system's deficit. So we want data that matters to us for both of those purposes. Recognition of data sovereignty, of our rights to data, and then free up the data, that's our data, like we're capable, we're governments, we have rights, we want ownership, access to data about our citizens. We want to improve the quality of the data. We want it to be accurate. We want to be able to rely on it. We want it to be like on time so that we can actually use it at a time that is relevant to us. We want to understand the trend through time so that we can compare, well, where were we 5 years ago? Where are we today? Like, how are we doing? Is what we're doing making a difference? We want some standardization of community data collection systems. This is something we've heard loud and clear for a long time. There's many other people apart from me who've been working on this for a long time. And this is like creating some systems that we can all have as governments so that there's good quality in our data, but also we can actually aggregate our own data and work together so that we're speaking the same language across our governments on things that matter collectively. And this is particularly important in the context of what Gwen was talking about with this major opportunity we have around a regional data center. Because we do need to be able to continue to produce population and provincial health reports. This is my like personal thing that really matters to me, is that like we need to support Indigenous governments to have access to and control their own data locally. And I'm hoping we collectively as Indigenous governments don't lose track of the power we have collectively to produce population-wide reports, because that is really what changes the system that our citizens are accessing every day, whether that be health, education, what have you. Next slide. So what does all of this mean? What am I talking about in like practice? Like, what does data governance look like in practice? So this is like quite simplified, but like when you think about working with data, there's like the creation of data or the acquiring of data as like a step. Then there's the stewarding and making sure that the data is secure, like the holding of the data, the possessing of the data. And then there's the like work we do to work with the data, right? So we analyze it and we report on it. So what do we want, and what is data governance rights? What do they look like at each of these steps? So if we were to acquire or collect data, like we want to actually validate that. We want to say like, yeah, we want that data collected. That makes sense for us. That purpose behind collecting it is something we care about. We want to shape the methodology by which the data is collected. So we hear this all the time. Like a good example of this would be the one I talked about earlier, right? If I'm asked at a certain point, like let's say I'm like literally laying in a hospital bed and someone comes over to me with like a survey or something, and I'm about to have surgery. And they're like, would you like to talk to us about your healthcare experience today? Like, is that gonna make me feel safe if I'm like right about? And what if I haven't had a great experience and I actually want to give honest feedback that actually I kind of felt like, you know, I was stereotyped. I'm not going to really do that. Like that methodology is not really safe. And there are probably like a million better ways to be able to collect that feedback from people if we were actually shaping the methodology and process. And we want kind of essentially what we're saying is we want Indigenous governance and decision-making throughout the entire process of deciding what's important, deciding how it's collected, and making all of the decisions throughout. Then once we have it, like we need to store it securely. We all want that, right? We all care about our personal privacy. That's all of our citizens care about that. We want it aligned with OCAP and applicable legislation. And by applicable, I mean sometimes our own laws. We do need security. We need it handled by people we identify who are authorized to access it. And we want to have properly structured information sharing agreements with partner organizations that we're either receiving data from or sharing information with. And then when it comes to analysis and dissemination, we want to analyze data from what's called here a wellness paradigm or a strengths-based approach or a non-stigmatizing lens that is aligned with who we are as people and the interests that we have in our community that doesn't feed into like weird stereotypes about us. We want our people to be involved in the analysis of the data, debate on what the data means, what we think it means. We want to own the intellectual property arising from the analysis and the reports. Again, there are protocols to support privacy. We don't want to report data that, you know, applies to two people and then those two people suddenly know it's about them and so does everybody else. Like we don't want to do that to our own citizens. When we develop a report, we want to be involved in approving that report. We want to approve it ourselves. And actually, we think that the data should always be presented to our own people first before it's shared in the public domain. So that's just like maybe a little bit more practically kind of what our rights might mean at different parts of the data governance lifecycle. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk briefly about just setting up your own internal data governance process. I just would like preface this by saying, like, everybody knows their own nation best. Like, I'm not here to tell people exactly what their process needs to look like. I'm just going to talk generally speaking about some of the features of setting up what this might look like. So this would be a situation where you've gone out, you've collected information, or you have information already, and you need to be able to manage requests for data that are coming in. Next slide. So the way we kind of think about it is like there's a set of interconnected aspects to kind of internal data governance, right? Ties to our vision, relates to principles. Those are cascaded into how we do things through law and policy, and then we have a structure for managing it. Next slide. So a vision statement is like, why do we have data? Why do we care about it as Indigenous government? So there's just an example on this slide here, but sometimes this is helpful, particularly in the phase of your work where you might be doing strategic planning or engaging with elected leadership on why data is important. And sometimes having a clear statement around this is a unifying way to get everybody kind of on the same page that we actually do care about data, and to have a clear statement of your government's rights and responsibilities related to data. Next slide. And then cascading that into what are the principles that tell us how we want to shape decision-making on data? Oftentimes, this is actually the most practical and applicable part for Indigenous governments, I find, because if you can kind of get your principles clear and everybody's on the same page about them, they do shape how everybody thinks and makes decisions. And often, particularly in most communities where, it's not like we have a lot of investment, external investment in data infrastructure, the most important part is actually that we're kind of aligned in our way of thinking. So here are a few principles that are somewhat common that I've seen before. So things like we govern all of our data regardless of where it is. Data about our citizens, we don't care who's housing it, we want to govern it. And that's a principle that would then describe how everybody would show up in some of your work with partners, for example. That analyses and publications would be culturally appropriate and reflect worldview. That they're actually supposed to benefit us and not stigmatize or just be done for someone else's career, but it's actually for us and of benefit to us. Things like will protect the privacy of individuals, that's important. So often principles are used to help shape governance and shape our collective way of making decisions and behaving as it relates to data. Next slide. And then those principles really become the foundation for law or policy. So we might have privacy policy, right? We might have information security policies. We might have laws in our governments related to those matters. So things like principles would then kind of translate into that and create your policy statements within that document. So in addition to that, in addition to those principles and the structures I'm going to talk about in a second, sometimes policies will also talk about set parameters for data management, which you're going to talk about at the next webinar, but would get into things like policies would require that data is clearly structured, documented, labeled, so that it's easy to retrieve, for example, right? It'll set these parameters for the quality of your data that will drive how data is managed. Next slide. This starts getting into you can only really have a data structure if it's if you've got enough work to do in data, if there's enough data requests to plow through, if there's enough kind of volume, and if your government's of a certain size. But this could also apply kind of again at that nation level or kind of regional level. And it'll be really important as this concept of a regional data center comes into reality. So I wouldn't get too hung up on this. I'm hesitant to even get into it too much, but essentially when your government has to make decisions about data. So like I said, there was that bubble diagram with the life cycle. So who is making those decisions then? And what's the structure by which you would make a decision, for example, to approve the release of a report or approve the use of data for analysis? You'd probably have some sort of internal kind of committee process to do that. Often it's tied to data stewards or people in your government that have responsibility. So an example might be let's say there was some sort of environmental, a spill of some type within, say, a stream or a water source for the community. And then we needed to access data about that stream and about the potential human health and community impacts of that. So a data access request might go in, say we need all the relevant data that is going to help inform our response to this environmental issue. So you might have corporate data, right? Like how often is the water, or how much have we invested in our water infrastructure? There'd be cultural data. What are our cultural uses of that territory? There might be land and resource data, like, you know, how often are we testing that water? Human data, what are the human health impacts of this spill? So there would need to be like a way to pull all the data from the different departments together to produce a report that says, here's the impacts of this spill potentially on our nation. And this helps support action planning moving forward. So just a bit of an example, but oftentimes, long story short, you need to kind of create a little bit of a structure to help manage data once you have some data to work with. Again, this doesn't apply in every case because we are still, many of our nations, my own included, kind of earlier on in our work to create data systems and to access data about our citizens. Next slide. So you're gonna hear my dog, she's like clicking around now around me. So now, external data governance. So that's all kind of our internal way of managing it. Now, when you actually want to go out and get data that's about your citizens that is stored externally, I'm just going to go through a few slides on that. Next one. So I know I was like already a downer on this earlier, so I'm sorry, but I'm going to do it like one more time. So often the data we think is going to be out there that we're going to be able to access, sometimes it's available, which is like great, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes we can't identify what data is Indigenous. Sometimes it resides somewhere we just can't access. So like in healthcare, for example, like most family doctors have like run private practices. So like they're not all connected in some big network where we can all access the data. It's not being collected at all from our communities, or it's not based on anything we care about. So there's just a natural inherent limitation in the data that's available. There's other barriers. I talked about cell size, other things where even on an anonymized basis, we can't collect it. And we know that like federal and provincial government systems are not aligned with our data sovereignty or data governance rights. But again, I'm hopeful that the work on disaggregated data and some of the work that Gwen is leading on the Regional Data Governance Center will force this alignment into place. Next slide. Okay, so with all that, those limitations in mind, when we want to access our data, what do? Well, we need to identify where it is. Like, is it within an Indigenous organization, or is it within kind of, let's say, the provincial government somewhere? So that's often the first step. And so it can be, for example, if I was looking for education data, I would approach both the Ministry of Education, and I would actually go to FNIGC as our organization, our partner, to ask them for advice on accessing that data. It's probably a bad example because I think that's quite a more accessible space in education than in other sectors, but knowing where it's housed is the first step. Asking them, well, how do I access my data, and what are your data governance protocols, so that you know from the beginning like what kind of hoops you're going to have to jump through, what kind of processes are going to exist, who's making decisions at what time, and whether at the end of it all, the data you're going to be able to access is going to be worth the effort you're going to have to put in to try to get it. Then you got to go through their data access request process, and sometimes you'll have to enter into an information sharing agreement with that entity. On the right-hand side of the slide is just like, it's like a little mini table of contents for typically what is in a data access request when you have to fill one out to access data about your own citizens that is stored elsewhere. So often you have to fill in information about your nation, the project that you're undertaking or why you're wanting the data, what specific data you're asking for, and what you plan to do with it and how you're going to store it. And again, sometimes these processes are government like provincial government processes, and sometimes they're processes of Indigenous organizations that are holding data about our citizens and stewarding that. Next slide. I talked briefly about you might have to enter into an information sharing agreement. It's just like it's an added document that spells out like what information is going to be shared with who and for what, like why. And so you can see there's a sample table of contents. So there's lots of good tools that exist either through the BCFNDGI or there's a collective of self-governing Indigenous governments that have been producing a data toolkit, a national kind of effort on a data toolkit that is also includes a bunch of templates for these kinds of things if you're looking for more practical tools. Next slide. So that can be really daunting to try to do when we're all running our own governments locally and responding to the needs of our citizens, and like it can seem like a lot. And so I just wanted to kind of offer a few reflections on doing this work together. So I am really excited about this concept of a regional data center because it can operate like by us and for us and founded in our rights, but also I think through working as a collective, create some economies of scale and develop some expertise that it's really hard for each of us to do on our own. So I do think that there are opportunities through that to kind of create new and improved processes for data governance. Like it probably felt pretty awful to listen to me talk about, oh, you're going to have to fill out this form that describes why your nation should have access to your own data. Like it's not good, right? Like we need to kind of work together to realign those processes. And I do think now's the time, as we have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in BC, we have this commitment, strong provincial commitment to greater collection of data that's going to be relevant to us. So I think it's on us. We can do the work to create new data governance agreements that are consistent with our rights. I think we can work together on the technical aspects, data collection, how we collect the data that matters to all of us. If something matters to all of us, then let's try to do it together. And if we each try to do it on our own, it'll cost a lot of money, and very few people will make a lot of money doing it. It won't be us. Creating the infrastructure, the technical capacity, all the systems, like I think all of that can be done through a data center as long as we're governing it. And I think there's work we could try to do. This is maybe a bit more of a stretch, but I think there's work we could do to standardize the data that we hold on a nation basis so that it's easier to communicate with each other and we can produce more timely reports, both at a local and nation level, as well as collectively, provincially. Next slide. So just in conclusion, like I've skimmed this like at my usual like fire hose lightning speed stuff, but like it does like I know it takes a lot of time to develop like a mature data governance framework, and it's never done. That's like something you just keep doing, right? Nobody does it perfectly. Everybody just kind of continues getting a little bit better and a little bit better. There's lots of tools out there for you, as I said, and I would just encourage you to use them. A lot of people have kind of blazed this trail before. Starting with leadership, management, support, and acceptance is important because we need leadership to be at the forefront of asserting our rights and making sure that that our rights-based approach is what's shaping data governance provincially. At a local level, sometimes you just have to start small with a specific project. So like, don't start with like a census, like maybe start with something smaller than that would be my advice if you're just getting going. And again, I'll just like for probably like the 10th time, just kind of conclude by saying that like this is an unprecedented time in front of us right now. I think that there is this opportunity for us to work collectively across our governments to ensure that Indigenous data sovereignty is grounding all of our work, and that is reflected in all of our agreements and in our institutions, including the possibility of this new regional data set, First Nations data center. So I'll stop there. And thanks for inviting me and for your patience with my like quick breeze through some of what I've learned about data governance. I think I'm back over to you, Gwen.
Thanking you very much for that, Harmony. I just wanted everybody to know that we'll have a little bit of a break now, or if you've got questions that you'd like to have Harmony answer, or just questions in general, please drop them in the chat box, because we're also, over the course of these 3 webinars, going to create an FAQ of all 3 levels that relates to all 3 levels of activity. So if anybody has a question for Harmony, please let that question fly now.
There are a couple of questions about resources and templates to support this work. Were there some you wanted to recommend, Harmony, or we could send them out afterwards?
Yeah, I was thinking there's obviously the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative templates. There's also kind of a prototype website that the group of the governments across Canada with treaties have been working on together. And I'll pop that link into the chat right now. And so they're also open to input, because that's something that I've been working with them on for some time. And so the site's not been like kind of formally publicized, but I'm sure if you want to use any of the tools and give feedback, they would be very grateful for that.
So if everybody wants to just give themselves a little wiggle, just a little bit of a breath, how you feeling, everybody? Because we're going to go back onto a bit of a discussion, or not a discussion, we're going to go back into a bit of a presentation, and then that'll wind up our afternoon. But this is a live and an ongoing conversation we're having. And Harmony's mentioned a couple times the possibility of a BC First Nations data center. It's not a possibility, it's going to happen, folks. Even if it's anyway, it's going to happen. It's something we've been pushing for a long time. So if there's any more questions, Bronwyn, are you seeing any specific questions for Harmony in the chat?
I think there are a few questions we could probably answer offline about regional discussions. You might want to speak to that, Gwen, when you're talking about FNDGS.
Okay, so are we good then to go into the next piece, Bronwyn? I see it's just after, we've only got just under half an hour left.
Yes.
Or do we need
absolutely.
a little break? Are you okay?
Well, we could just, yeah, I think the stretching was a good idea. It's a lot of brain processing time, but I think we can keep moving along too.
Okay, so I'll just get Michelle to load up my slides. There's just a few slides there, and we will be speaking a bit about templates for this type of work. So I'm sure that you were all on the session we had a couple of weeks back with Dr. Christopher Horstleaf and myself, where we were talking about data sovereignty. And in that conversation, we were really talking about the times they are a-changing, and they have changed. And I think that's what Harmony was saying, that, you know, even the work that we did in templates that were 5 or 6 years ago, because the context in which we live has changed so much. The era we're in now is a drip era. So the templates we developed years ago might not be, suitable, or in their entirety. A lot of it will be, but in their entirety, given that we are where we are now. And where we are now is, as I mentioned by a couple of people, very exciting times, given that we've never had really a recognition of our rights. So go ahead and click for me, please. Just acknowledging those rights that we do have, I think, is really important. Click again, because this is probably just going to unfold this first page. So there we go. I think it's really important in the context that we are living within, to each one of us as nations, and this is what I'd suggested in the data sovereignty webinar. In beginning this conversation around data sharing, data governance, data sharing, it really starts with data sovereignty, and that's taking ownership and then working towards controlling your data. So if you think about OCAP, ownership and control is really about governance. It's about taking ownership and setting standards for anybody that would have access and possession or manage the data that you have. And so on the data sovereignty session, I'd suggested that each one of us in British Columbia, 34 unique language groups, that each one of us take the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, take Indigenous people out and put yourselves in it, so that declaration starts to read very differently than in the vague context of being Indigenous people, and starts to be very specific to who you are and what your rights are. So starting at that as a given, just acknowledging that those are basic set of rights that both the other governments, federally and provincially, have agreed to. Now it's about us actually taking them and making meaning of them. So the first thing to do is put yourself into those rights. That's not them in its entirety. We know that our rights go a little bit beyond what's perhaps in those articles to be defined by us over time. And so as we start to do our work, putting ourselves into that as a first step in taking ownership and control, and assertion, just a simple assertion. And on the last webinar, we included a link to a very simple document that is an assertion of data sovereignty. It doesn't require a lot of documents aside from that. It's a very simple assertion. It's just saying, here we are, this is who we are, and this is the rights that we have in relation to data. So, for this work we're going to talk about in data sharing, it's important that you've brought yourself back to that place on data sovereignty. So in your free time, you go back and familiarize yourself with that, and Bronwyn has shared the links to all of that information, and then start that work to actually put yourself in there. So go ahead and click the next slide, please. Because as we do that, and for my own nation, the Ktunaxa Nation, we really start to think about ourselves in a context of this UN DRIP, but it's such a vague thing that they put us in. So they talk about Indigenous peoples having rights, but they being the federal and provincial governments, are not going to be the ones to say who the Indigenous peoples are. We've got to step into that. And as soon as we do that, we have responsibilities. So the rights transfer to responsibilities for our governing bodies immediately, because they're the governing bodies that make sure our rights are not infringed upon, so that our rights are actually honored. So Harmony was talking a little bit about some principles and some very basic statements that you might make. And for us, really, we acknowledge that the Ktunaxa governing bodies hold rights on behalf of Ktunaxa citizens. They're the governing bodies for us, those Ktunaxa governing bodies. That our governing bodies are the ones who are going to assert intellectual property ownership and say that they are the ones who are asserting data sovereignty as well, because those two go hand in hand. They will define what data quality is, and this is absolutely important, because before you go sharing your data with anybody else, there's got to be a reason to share that data. And data quality is something that is unique to each of us. When you define something that is of quality to you at the level of your unique nation level, then you can perhaps aggregate up to something that you can look at your neighbors to say, oh, it's important to you too. That's important to us. But when they start at the 1,000-foot level, sometimes they lose us. We lose ourselves in that. So when Harmony's talking about population data at the provincial level, absolutely important, but it needs to be pushed upwards to that level, so that we can define what the population is at the broader level by having the unique populations recognized at the base level. The Ktunaxa population is only about 2,000 people in Canada. So that size of a population is barely enough for really scientific sort of use and analysis of data. But inside of that, it's really about us knowing ourselves. And so every one of those 2,000 Ktunaxa people are important. But individual data is personal data. As soon as it becomes a Ktunaxa, then it's Ktunaxa data and it's population data. My nation took time to actually define what quality data was, because we took time to start defining what a strong, healthy Ktunaxa citizen and community were. Over time, putting measurements to those things that mattered to us. We went through an exercise where we took our indicators and shared them with the provincial government, and they looked through their population data with their population data center, looked through a whole bunch of their ministries all over the place for data that might relate to what our interests were. So they came back, the province, with about 700 or so indicators that they found from all across their ministries, but only a couple dozen of them actually related to what our concept of wellness was, well-being. The majority of their data is about deficits. So, when you're diseased or when you fail something, they can measure those things. But for us, we want to know what a strong, healthy Ktunaxa and community, what we're doing in that way. So defining what quality is a very important first step before you even go looking to see who's got data that you might want. Because when we looked at the data, it was there, it's like, no, we don't need that data. We don't want to share that data. The data that we collect that's meaningful to us, only so much of it will be shared with the other governments. So the very first step is really that assertion of data sovereignty, just setting the table for yourselves and telling the other governments, hey, this is us. Because in doing that, you're basically giving them a warning that things are not the same as they used to be. And because the Minister of Indian Affairs, Indigenous Services Canada, has acknowledged data sovereignty, Indigenous data sovereignty, and so has the provincial government, and so has the DRIP law. They've got to live up to that now. It's about us putting ourselves into this and defining what it is we want to share with the other governments. It's setting the table in a different way now, which is challenging when there's 200 community governments in BC, 34 unique nation groups, and some of our communities are very, very small. So by us working together, it's almost you can't do it without working together. So you don't lose your sovereignty in working together. And in fact, by us working together as nation groups, recognizing each other's data sovereignty, it empowers us to be that much more, giving us that much more recognition. So click, please. It's important at this time, I think, to really understand the difference between governance and government, especially as we're thinking about data quality and sharing agreements. So governance is about setting the standards for anything. And so that's your work that your people have got to do, your people. Government are institutions we empower to do things for us. So if we set up a BC data center, it would be considered part of First Nations government, not our governance. It wouldn't be us as the unique nations doing that. It would be like a First Nations public service agency, almost like FNPSS here that's supporting these engagement sessions, these discussion sessions. So once you have put your standards in place, which is governance, which has to be your own people doing that work, then you're going to tell all the institutions, whether they're inside your own governments, child welfare, health, employment, education in your own communities, or the other governments. So remember, those people that are carrying out programs and services in federal and provincial domains, they're part of government. They're not the legislative body that's setting the standards by which they will live. That's the legislature. So we know for us here in our world, we haven't had a lot of time, a lot of luxury, and a lot of investment in governance. But where we are now, as we move into the DRIP, we can actually get a clearer picture of who we are and set the table for direct investments in our governance development. It has to happen. And as we do the work towards data center, we can, as is being done prior and will continue to be done, do templated versions of various things so that we can take something that is legally defensible, etc., and put our own interests into it and put our own worldview into it. Because British Columbia has got 34 unique languages because we are 34 unique peoples, not just because we chose to have a different language one day. And I think we're finally getting across to some of the other governments on how important language is in our whole concept of identity and relations. It's not just about a Heritage Canada thing here. We're talking about the core of the whole government to government and nation to nation relationships. So click, please. There is in British Columbia right now a data quality sharing agreement that was drafted as an enabler for the work that we did collectively as BC First Nations to transfer the authority from the federal government for health services that were held by First Nations Inuit Health Branch. When we did that work collectively as BC First Nations, and Harmony was involved in all of this early work, she didn't mention much of that, but the Health Council, who was the political organizations at that time, they drafted this and negotiated this tripartite data quality sharing agreement with the province and the federal government in order to position ourselves in such a way where we could have access to data that was going to be required to administer the programs and services that were formerly held by FNIB. Got to remember that this is just an administrative takeover. We did not go at this as rights and title work. And in fact, one of the 7 directives for the First Nations Health Authority is without prejudice to our work. We're supposed to be building human resource capacity, et cetera, community-driven, nation-based, the number 1 directive. So when we think about this existing tripartite data quality and sharing agreement, and it was signed in 2010 and it exists today, it's just been re-signed a couple of times to get us to this place. It's acknowledged that it's kind of in the old language, like I was mentioning, some of these old agreements and some of the old documents, they become out of date. And so this agreement, it actually mentioned in the initial drafting that it was intending that there would be a day where the nations themselves would assume the responsibility for our data. knowing that many of us were at various levels of development. Some nations are now very capable and very sophisticated and can manage their own data. Others are not. So we've got to continue to do this work collectively until we can all do it on our own. That said, there's always going to be the need for some kind of a data center, because not only does that data center serve the nations, but it can serve the groups that serve the nations. For example, the First Nations Financial Management Board, when they were created, there was also a FNIGC, a statistical institute that was created at the same time that was intended to help those organizations with their financial components, et cetera, but also to serve the nations. That data center, that statistical institute never did make it. The Financial Management Board did. And so they're asking about how can this national data strategy and the BC Data Center support BC First Nations in their fiscal reform processes? Absolutely it can. And so as we start this conversation around TDQSAs, we're going to be presenting a templated draft that each nation will then be able to take home, make their data assertion of data sovereignty, and then start looking at this data quality sharing agreement. But start by thinking about data quality. So this templated agreement, as I say, or this old agreement is still in place, but it's intended that we will update it and have each of the nations assuming their data ownership and control, and in fact, delegating to the First Nations Health Authority and any other agency they see fit, authority to function on their behalf. That is a right that every one of our governing bodies has. Click, please. So what my nation is doing right now is we're starting to draft what we would consider a Ktunaxa Nation data sharing agreement, with the understanding that the Ktunaxa Nation is the whole of the Ktunaxa peoples, and that our governing bodies are the ones who sign agreements for us at this point in time. And so right now we have 4 governing bodies, and those governing bodies would collectively assert data ownership and control over all Ktunaxa data. They, yes, would have the capacity independently to use, collect, and manage the data that they need to do in carrying out their dailies. But when we come time to actually measure the wellness of the Ktunaxa population, it would be done on that whole, the basis of the whole, so that we can also include Ktunaxa citizens who are not living in any one of our communities. So discussion is underway about how we make sure that all of those people, including, of course, the people who are not status Indians right now, who are still Ktunaxa citizens, how do we include them? And so one of the very first exercises that we said we needed to have with the other 2 governments is just basically that, to determine who our citizens are and to find ways to manage the identity of our citizens when they're in the environments of the other governments. And so as Harmony was saying, that it's hard to find data on our people because every different department or agency or ministry does it their own way. And so what we're going to do collectively is to stop that and set some standards. So each nation will be able to determine what it is, the quality, et cetera, but that the other governments will all at once understand that it will be each nation doing this work. So one by one, we will assert data sovereignty, and we will take a draft templated type of an agreement and make it our own, but doing it all at the same time so that the other governments, it's not a one-off, it's that everybody's at this. Because when it's a one-off, they don't pay much attention to it. But when we do this collectively, it becomes a standard. It becomes, they can do nothing but come along with us when we do this work collectively. So click one more time. There has been some discussion today about principles and about how we would bring some principles into the work that we're doing so that they start to shape up sort of how we relate to the other governments and how the other governments relate to us. And that was a lot of what the Ktunaxa have done over the years, was we actually took time to do a vision, values, principles. So the values, we started to say, what are the things we value as a Ktunaxa people? Well, we value transparency and honesty and trust. We value sharing and generosity. So how do we actually see and find evidence of those things that we value in our data and in the relationships we have with the other governments? So for the Ktunaxa, some of the principles we have are that Ktunaxa governing bodies are governments elected or selected by the Ktunaxa people to, amongst other things, protect Ktunaxa identity, revitalize our language and culture, rebuild Ktunaxa institutions, and provide services to Ktunaxa citizens and others. So some of these principles are like, wow, they inform the other governments of what your beliefs are and where you're intending to go with this, right? One of the other principles we have Data and information are critical tools for self-determination. And in fact, self-determination for us is about putting in front of yourself what it is you want to measure for yourself, determining for yourself who you are now, who you were historically, and who you want to be in the future. Another one of our principles would be Ktunaxa ownership over Ktunaxa language, culture, and intellectual property is recognized as a foundation of our self-determination. So as we start to put these principles on a page, we start to feel a certain way, and then we start to realize these things that are important have got to be brought into these agreements that we're bringing into place with these other governments. And so the purpose of our data sharing agreement to recognize the Ktunaxa people and our governing bodies, the inherent rights holders in relation to intellectual property, etc. So as we start to draft a Ktunaxa specific data quality sharing agreement, we've also been working on a templated guide to drafting a data quality sharing agreement. And a beautiful woman's name was mentioned earlier, Laurel Lemchuk-Favel, hands up to Laurel, a phenomenal data scientist, I would say, much more than I am, and has been doing some great work for First Nations Indigenous peoples for many, many years. And so she's going to be working with me as the Ktunaxa are doing our work in helping to actually create this templated version so that each one of our groups can take it home and make it our own. So this work is just starting now, and hopefully by, I would say within the next couple of months, we would have some kind of a drafted template available to you. So you're going to need to watch the BCFNDGI website. And really, we hope by then we will have some more resource coming from the federal budget that's to implement the national data strategy. And one of the things we're calling for in BC is a working group structured with all of the 200 Indigenous governing bodies delegating to a group of people, and I would say at least 34, so each language group, each nation group is recognized there, to help us move that national strategy forward. So as a working group, once we get some resources in place, to help us do that in the collective space. So it's not one-off and it's not costing us as individual nations. So there's national money that will be coming for us to do this collective work. So this data sharing agreement, as noted, will do many things for the Ktunaxa Nation. And really, as I say, establishing that foundation for when we think that there is quality data for repatriation of that data. Data sharing is one thing, data repatriation is another. So any data that those other governments have that can be identified to our population is our data. So I had to correct the First Nations Health Authority the other day in that the Population Health and Wellness Agenda, the report that they produce using the First Nations client file, which is our status numbers basically, it erroneously said that the FNHA, the Health Authority, owns the client file. So I just made sure that it was known that no, they don't own the client file. Each one of our nations owns the data, the client file that attaches to our nations, and they have the management authority over it, but they don't own it. And so that's one of the things we will do in our TDQSA is to delegate to the FNHA or other groups, whatever it is we believe the functions that they need to do on our behalf are. So it's a no-brainer when it comes to particular health data that the FNHA would do certain things for us. But that's about it, because we know our data goes far beyond health. It's all over everything. So one more click, please. Right now, if you want to, there is a guide that is available, and it was prepared by the Alberta First Nations Information Governance Center. They already have a data center up and running in Alberta, not fully fledged and not doing the things that we would believe they would want them to do in the future. But it's the center that's helping to manage these surveys like the health survey, employment survey, labor survey that the National FNIGC does. And so they are the regional organization for the First Nations Information Governance Center. This document here, and click one more time, please, was developed a number of years ago. So it's not necessarily up to DRIPA standards, but it is a very good guide for looking at data sharing agreements. And those might be research data sharing agreements with a public institution like a college or a university and your community government, or it might be your own researchers in a data sharing agreement with someone else. So if you see on the top of this slide, it's got a website address, and you can go on the AFNIGC website and look at their tools and resources. And just like the BCFNDGI has a number of resources, so do they. And the agreement is, of course, across Canada that let's all make these things available so we can all benefit as best we can. So you can go on there and look at this particular guide, and it's a guide for developing data sharing agreements. Go ahead and click one more time, please. And as I'd mentioned, that the work that's underway right now should be available within a month or two as a templated BC data quality sharing agreement guide. And we will be bringing that onto the BCFNDGI.com website, the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative website. And my hands up to Cowichan Tribes, Heiltsuk Tribe, Gitxsan Government Commission, Penticton Indian Band, and Seabird Island for their support historically in all of the data governance work we did. They were the team, the community team that worked with the Ktunaxa Nation, government to government, in doing the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative. We were the founding groups for that. And now, of course, we have had no resources for probably about 6 years for the BCFNDGI work. So we've been pushing to this national strategy to try to get the resources, and hopefully they're going to be coming soon. So we want to be updating that website to include a lot of the different types of resources that have been developed lately, and to all of these different guides, and more importantly, to start building a forum for the discussion and to house the conversation as we move forward towards the BC Data Center. So that's what sort of where we are with the data quality and sharing agreements. And anybody that has registered for this event will get these decks, but we'll also have your contact information so that when that draft template is done, we can send a notice out to you as well. So that's all I have to share with you today. I see we've only got a few more minutes for questions and answers. But as I say, if you drop them in the chat, we will put it in the FAQ and make sure we get back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gwen, and Harmony for your tireless work in this area. Gwen, you've been working so hard at this and getting things to where they are at right now. So I would invite, there's some words of thanks and appreciation in the chat. We also had a couple of questions just before you began, Gwen. One was a question from Lorianne about data standards and that they're often implicitly based on a specific worldview. Are you just suggesting or discussing building data standards that are unique to each nation?
So in my opinion, every nation has to do that. It's part of self-determination. That said, there's two components I like to bring to this conversation. One is legitimacy, and that's about worldview and making sure that it is what it needs to be. The other one is credibility, and that's where we have to have it done with a scientific basis. So there is that, the data, it's a quality data, but it's also done to a standard that is, it allows you to have some credibility in it. So in those two things, what we acknowledge is that as nations do determine what's important to them, we can also then look up to one level to do some aggregation. So for example, Harmony was speaking about how important it is for us to be connected to our cultural heritage. That's a generic statement. When you take that home and make it your own, it means something different to each of us. So my people are beads and feathers teepee people. When you go towards the coast, it's a very different cultures. So it has to be done from each nation group, their worldview, but then looking up to where we can all see some commonality so that we all know that we are getting better. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. Lorianne, if you would like to add more to that, please do. We also had a question from Trevor and saying he's struggling with data sovereignty versus the lower cost of massively scalable cloud solutions like Salesforce or Amazon Web Services. Is what is needed a replication of those types of systems specifically for Indigenous groups?
Yeah, so I try to separate data governance and sovereignty and all of that from technology. So until you figure out what your business case is, technology is everybody's salesman who's ever the best salesman, right? So until you know data quality and then you can look where's the data, you might not need a big sophisticated system. You might need small systems. So that's what we acknowledged the Ktunaxa many years ago, was that initially they thought we were going to have to build a big sophisticated system. And then we realized, no, we actually had to just build language that spoke to a lot of sophisticated systems and brought data from multiple places. So I would suggest to people, caution on the technology right now until you go through the exercise of determining what quality is and knowing what you need for data. And then you can look at the solutions for how to get it and how to control it and take care of it. Because as the data center starts to be developed, that's a big piece of what it will be doing for us, is helping to look at the technology and getting the best costing and the best bang for the buck for us.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Gwen. And I will read out a few of the words of thanks and appreciation as we close out at 2:30 here. Many thanks, very informative, absolute thanks. Wow, powerful messages. Thank you for pulling this together. Wonderful session. Looking forward to the next one. So with that, I would like to raise my hands to you both for your time in preparing for and delivering today's session. Many thanks to you. And again, to everyone, we will be sharing the recording and session materials with everyone who's registered. See you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Blessings to everybody. Take care. Be safe.